Welcome to the Misfit Squad podcast,
where we invite you to embrace your difference and to discover a spectrum of possibilities and change what's wrong about you into what is strong about you.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Misfit Squad podcast. Today we're talking about sensory processing. What is that? And how many senses do you think we have? We commonly believe that we have only 6 senses. But did you know that we actually have 8? Even though Trina just showed us 5. We have 8.
No, I'm just saying it's five common ones.
Oh, yes, there are 5 common ones. But we actually have 8. So this show is an introduction into sensory processing, and we'll be doing a series of shows where we talk specifically about each of the different 8 senses that we're referring to. So Trina is going to take it away.
All right, guys, we really do have 8 senses, but typically the most common ones are vision, which is your sight, auditory, sound, coming from your ears, olfactory, which is your nose, your smell, and gustatory is taste. And then we also have touch, which is called tactile. So vision, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, and tactile are your main 5 ones that we normally talk about when people talk about their senses. But there's 3 hidden ones, and the first one is like my favorite, and it's called proprioception. And it's basically the sensations from your muscles and joints, and it allows you to know where you are in space. Like knowing if you hold your arm out to the side of you, you can feel that your arm is out on the side of you, not that you're looking at it. You just know that it's there. Proprioception, another example would be if you bump into walls a lot, which we'll talk about later, like not knowing where you're at, or you walk or you trip a lot. So that's proprioception. And then vestibular is your sense of movement in space. So it's the sense of your head. So wherever your head is, if it's off to the side, then your body adjusts accordingly. So it's movement. So it's something like swinging, roller coaster rides, even driving, roller skating, roller blading, like all of those are like movement. And the last one, which most people don't ever even talk about, is called interoception. And it's the sensations from your internal organs. It's what allows us to feel our internal organs and gives us information regarding the internal state. So like that's your heart rate, your breathing rate, like if you're thirsty, you're hungry, or you got to go to the bathroom. That's all coming from your interoception system, which is a huge part of all of it. So basically, when we talk about sensory processing, we're talking about how our body receives information from like the environment around us, and then how it like analyzes that and then responds accordingly. And we all have our own little unique sensory systems and needs and our preferences, which we will talk more about as well. But basically our senses all work together to help us have a general perception of ourselves and our environment. And having that multi-sensory, meaning incorporating all of those senses, is basically, it's a huge component to overall development. So if you want to get like a little technical, which Kim and I usually don't talk technical on here, but sensory processing disorder, known as SPD, is a neurological disorder of the process by which we receive information through our senses, how we organize that information, and then how we use it to participate and engage in everyday activities. So
it's kind of a mouthful.
I know. So it's basically a way you receive information, how you process it, and then the output according to what environment you're in.
So I have a question / example. So I can't wear like the very first thing I do in any piece of clothing I purchase is cut the tags out. Because if the tag is poking me, right?
Yeah.
Or I can feel the tag. There's something about tags, like I can feel the tag. It is the only thing I can be aware of. I cannot.
Yep.
So that is one of the things that we're talking about. That's like a sensory processing breakdown.
Yeah. Well, it's that would be what I was going to talk about is hypersensitive or overly sensitive. So you become overwhelmed by feeling the tag in your clothes. I do that too. I'm the same way. And then there's lots. The cool thing is now there's even Target has a new line out with tagless clothes.
Mm-hmm.
And tagless, like the way they did the zippers and everything is all different. So it's really cool. So kind of backing up a little bit, sensory processing disorder is basically like a traffic jam of information coming into the brain. It's like when you get so much information in there and then you can't get it filtered out. So a child or an adult with sensory processing issues often responds to the environment in a little different ways. And I'm saying different with like air quotes because everybody's different. So like Kim just explained with the thing with the tags, that is being hypersensitive or overly sensitive, but you can also be hypo or undersensitive or underreactive. And that's where you seek out like sensory stimulation.
Mm.
And then it can even show up as a combination of those things. So like in one area, you could be like hypersensitive. In another area, you could be under or hyposensitive. So that's why SPD or sensory processing disorder creates difficulties with modulation, with basically modulating how your body is processing all that information. So that's
and that's interesting because like actually I hadn't really thought about the other side of that with the hypo, because most of what I've experienced way back a super long time ago when I was a nanny in college, I had a couple of kids who had SPD. And I think that was in the early days when they were just starting to like that became a thing that got diagnosed, right? But they were all kind of severe on the hyper side, which created a lot of like really intense physical acting out and different things. So I just think that's an interesting thing to point out, is that it can be the other side and you wouldn't necessarily know that that's what was going on.
Right, exactly. So basically what happens is this sensory information that you're getting gets misinterpreted or mixed up in the brain. And then the brain creates a different response or an inappropriate, air quotes, response for that given environment that you're in. And typically you're not labeled sensory process with a label of sensory processing disorder unless it's something that really starts to impact your daily life in a significant way. Mm-hmm. But you can still have a lot of sensory issues and not have to have the diagnosis of sensory processing disorder. Just as Kim said, like I have a ton of sensory issues too. I mean, if you guys do watch us on YouTube or even listen to us, I have a really hard time looking at the camera. Like when I talk, my eyes are all over the place. That's a sensory thing. I can't handle directly having eye contact a lot of the time. That's another example. So when I look crazy, I am crazy.
Well, and so the reason that we're having this conversation, in part, well, a lot of it is because we're actually really fascinated by this topic, particularly proprioception and interoception, which we'll definitely talk about a lot more later and in detail. But also, it's that same thing, we always talk about awareness. And so if you notice that you have these issues, or someone that does, your kids, for example, like now that you have an awareness of what this is or what could be going on, how can things show up differently now how can you help create more ease for your kids if you recognize, oh, or if you ask, is that a sensory processing issue?
Yeah.
And what can we do to do that? And then what can we do? Trina, I know that you have some examples or exercises, or we have some suggestions for how to improve your sensory processing, deal with sensory processing breakdowns, or.
So like Kim said, we're basically, this podcast is more of like, hey, here's an explanation of it, an overview of it, so you can start being aware of like, oh, there is this thing called sensory processing. We have way more than 5 senses. We actually have 8. And when they don't work together very well is when things start looking a little mishappy. So one of the things that does occur is what's put into place a lot of times, if you do have a lot of sensory issues, is what's called a sensory integration plan, or also known as, or more known as, a sensory diet. But it's not about food, although it can involve food in the mouth. It's basically a strategy that's really tailored to each individual to manage the sensory processing system. So it involves like sensory stuff, it involves physical activities, and also involves accommodations that help that individual or that person to be in what we call in a I'm using a lot of air quotes today, just right state, which that helps you be in more of an optimal state for learning, for attention, for socializing, and even like for behaviors in a variety of settings. And when I say just right, what I'm talking about is for those who have a tendency to be overstimulated, a sensory diet can help them go from like an overloaded or an overwhelmed state to a state of calm. Or the opposite, what we talked about earlier when we were talking about hypo or underactive. Like, so if you have if a child or adult feels sluggish, lethargic, tired, a sensory diet or integration plan can help them become more alert and active. So then you're more willing and able to engage in the environment you're in. Whether that, I mean, as kids, that can be in school for like learning. It also can be at home for socializing. Like adults, it can be like in having meetings. There's a lot of that happening right now, especially because so many of us are online and on Zoom meetings. So you do get sluggish. So it's like the biggest thing about the sensory integration plan is finding that really unique balance for yourself to where you can be at that just right state. So that's when Kim was talking about like different activities, that's what we're doing, is looking at what's going on with each individual person. So then you can figure out, oh, okay, this activity would help them come back up to that just right state, or this activity will help them come down to that just right state. That's what we're talking about. And just really quick, before we can give you a few examples today on each one of those senses, but you might, like what I wanted to share is like, you might be asking, okay, so how do I know if myself or my child needs to or could benefit from a sensory diet? So these are just some indicators, and these are only just a few. And I'm just going to read them from a list that I have. You or your child could constantly be on the go, like they're just moving all the time, or being physically active to the point that they can't settle down to do a task. And another one, like we were talking about, they may look really tired, lethargic, or sluggish. You can become restless in crowds or groups of people, or you can become really wound up or overwhelmed after being in a crowd, to the point of like, sometimes you'll see somebody holding their ears or like covering their eyes. It's because it's too much auditory input or too much visual input. They disregard, or they don't have any understanding of personal space. And what I mean by that is kind of like, you know, when you're with somebody and they're like literally right in your face. or they're like touching you, that kind of stuff. That's like when people are so unaware of like their own personal space and someone else's personal space. And everybody's is different. Another thing is a kid can be constantly touching textures or people, like I was talking about, like everything they walk by, they touch, like a chair, a table, the wall, the door. It's because they get input from that, but constantly touching. They also may crave fast, like spinning or intense movement. So a lot of swinging or getting in a chair, like an office chair like this, and sitting and just spinning, like those kinds of things. A lot of times with sensory issues, you also have a high tolerance to pain, meaning you could fall down and get hurt, or you could cut yourself or do something and be bleeding and not even know it. And not cry, unless it's super intense, and then you'll see something. Another thing is you'll see a lot of jumping or like crashing into things or bumping into things, meaning like done on purpose. Like go crash on the floor, crash into the couch or a bunch of pillows, or jumping on a trampoline a lot, or just jumping in general, because they're looking for that deep pressure input. I think I mentioned it before, but they love movement such as swinging, merry-go-rounds, slides. You'll see rocking. You can see like sometimes like you can be sitting in your chair and there'll be like a lot of rocking movement. I do that too. So none of these are saying that this is wrong. These are just like indicators of what sensory stuff is.
Do bunches of all those things.
I know. I do a lot. As you can tell when I'm talking, I'm all over the place. There's also the thing of being too rough in play, meaning not able to judge like your I don't want to say, like when you're overly roughhousing and not realizing it's to the point of hurting somebody. Also trouble modulating your tone of voice. So when you're around people who talk really, really loud, or they like get really, really soft, like that's more me. They have a hard time modulating what their tone of voice is required for each given environment. And a couple more, a lot of times, if you have severe sensory, not even severe, you will avoid hugs or cuddling. It's not even severe, but avoid hugs and cuddling, being with family members. Like you'll see a lot of times that if they come up to you, they'll totally hug you and they're okay with that. But if you go up to them and you try to hug them, like it's an all out, like
stop touching me,
or it's an all out tantrum. It's too much. It's an overload, too much sensations happening. And one more thing is like sometimes you'll see a tendency to bolt or run away when they're overwhelmed, stressed, or in an unfamiliar situation. So that's only a few indicators, but that's some that may demonstrate like that a sensory integration plan, or just being aware of what's needed to basically bring them back to that just right.
So for the parents that follow here and listen, so if you're seeing those kinds of behaviors in your children, our programmed response is to be frustrated or upset and automatically like, oh, they're being a butt, or they're acting out, or they're not, that they're misbehaving on purpose, that they're making a conscious choice to be difficult.
Right.
And instead, then if you can reframe in your head and ask, knowing this, now that we've talked about this, like, okay, what's actually going on here? Are they having a sensory issue? And then how can that inform and change your response? And if your response is different than it would be, how can that change things for your child?
Yeah, exactly. It's really being aware, because a big part of it too is knowing all these indicators and then actually catching it before there's an all-out temper tantrum, or before you get so overwhelmed as an adult with sensory stuff that you can't engage in the meeting that you're supposed to be in, or those kinds of things. So the sensory stuff is really amazing, and it really does affect all of us, we all have some form of unique sensory processing. Like, just as a simple example, you'll see adults who are in meetings that will either like twist their hair a lot, or they'll like take a pencil and like tap it on the desk, or they'll be tapping their foot or chewing gum. Those are all ways to help modulate your system that they figure out. It's kind of like being able to self-regulate. You've known like, okay, I'm about ready to fall asleep here, so I need to get a drink of water, or I need to go get some gum, or that kind of thing. So it shows up in all different ways.
Yes,
And I guess really quick before we get off, and like Kim said earlier, we'll go over each system in a little bit more detail to give some more input. But simple stuff to like kind of look for is like, or that you can actually do for like sight, is you can do, this is more for like kids, but you could play catch like with a ball. You could do dot to dots or word searches. Those are all, or like even using one of those like kaleidoscope things. And you have to look, or even binoculars, but kaleidoscope, and you have to look through it and see the stuff turning. Those are all things for sight. Taste, I already kind of mentioned, chewing gum, blowing whistles. One other thing that's really awesome to do is taking straws and blowing like cotton balls, those kinds of things, or even like doing just deep massage to the mouth. Smell would be, well, food, sensing any of the different smells of that, but you can also do like scratch and sniff stickers, or like essential oils. And they even have like scented Play-Doh or scented like scented slime that you can smell. Hearing. That's a lot of like auditory processing. So one thing would be like playing a game of Simon Says. Simon says, touch your nose, then, you know, that whatever you do with Simon Says, because you have to listen and then perform that activity. There's also what they call Metronome Activities, where it's basically, you can get apps and different things that have like a beat or a pattern. So when you're trying to do something, that inputs in the background with like a rhythm. And then touch, that's a variety. Like if it's you need light touch, then it would be like playing with like feathers, like boa, you know, feather boas, or even like using a really light dry washcloth. You can also do what we call sensory bins, and we'll talk more about that, but basically it's just a container full of different textures, like rice, dry beans, dry noodles, even cooked noodles. And you play in it. I know, right? You can even use like drawing in like shaving cream, or drawing in like pudding, that kind of stuff. And then the vestibular system, which is the movement, would be swinging, getting on a swing, swinging, hanging, sometimes even hanging out upside down, like laying on the couch and hanging upside down. Or if you have one of those big therapy balls, you can get on the ball and roll. That's basically vestibular, simple form. And then proprioception, the deep pressure part, would be doing like animal walks. So that's like a bear crawl, or doing like push-ups. But one great thing is just actually taking a pillow or a cushion or one of those therapy balls and laying on the floor, have your child lay on the floor and just firmly roll it over them and like squish them. Don't do it on the mouth, because you don't need to be suffocating them. So those are the main ones. And then interoception is a little tricky, and it's more a lot of using a lot of mindfulness techniques. And there's a thing called zones of regulation, which we will go over, and social stories, and we'll go over all that stuff later. But it is more about really being aware of those little small innate things happening in your body. So That was a lot of information.
That was a lot of information. I just want to say, I actually don't know for sure that this is true, but it's my sense about it. And that is that if you pick one of these easy ones, like the visual or the tactile, and start doing some of those things, I have a suspicion that as you work on one, there are actually improvements to others as well. I have a feeling it's like, well, fascia is a whole nother conversation. So let's use the spider web as an example instead. It's like the interconnectedness of the spider web. You can't really touch anywhere on the spider web without vibrations of the touch going to the entire web, right? So I imagine the same sort of thing with the senses and doing the sensory integration plan and the sensory work, that one will, working on auditory stuff will inform the visual or etc.
Exactly. And it really, everybody's different, but it really does. Like, for example, like that, the proprioception, you work on that, it addresses so much. The touch, the interoception, the even the smell, all of it. So like it all works together. So even sometimes just starting off with one or two activities can make a difference.
Right. And this is really also just, it's at the very bottom level, we're actually really still talking about what we always talk about, which is being more aware, right? Where all of our senses are different kinds of awareness delivery, essentially, different kind of awarenesses, and being mindful and then acknowledging and being aware of them and then using them to our advantage, essentially. So we're really talking, we're kind of, this whole conversation about our 8 senses is talking about being aware, acknowledging our awareness, and instituting it with our physical experience in our bodies on the planet, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it truly is. And that's why Kim and I like talking about it, because it really does go back to a lot of the other tools that we talk about regarding awareness. Because one thing also that you may get a lot if you yourself or you do have a kid with sensory processing or sensory issues, everybody will always say, you're so sensitive, or you're too sensitive. And sometimes, is it actually a sensitivity or is it actually an awareness? Like sometimes you're so overly aware of so many things, it shows up as looking as you're like so sensitive. But like that has helped me immensely in my life, because I made myself so wrong, because I got a ton of these issues. And I was like, oh my God, like I am like a disaster walking. But really what it is like, I'm like so aware of the subtle things that a lot of people aren't aware of. And same for Kim. And that when you can get that and look at this as actually a capacity and not something that's wrong about you, it can totally change everything.
Yeah. So stay tuned for more. We won't be doing these all in a row necessarily. So, but we will over the next several weeks be covering in like we'll have specific shows where we're only talking about proprioception or the various senses. So stay tuned, check those out.
And if you guys want, like in the meantime, like what we were talking about, the awareness and stuff, go to energeticsignatureformula.com, and there is a free PDF that you can download on tips and tools to overcome anxiety and overwhelm.
Yep. Awesome. All right. So we'll see you guys next time.
Well, bye, guys.
Thank you for listening to the show.
Our target is to make your awareness easy to use and to acknowledge the power of not fitting in.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and share it with someone you know.
Why fit in when you were born to stand out?
Embrace your difference. Join the Misfit Squad.